Harper Cole never planned on being anywhere near the Iron Brotherhood that day. She was simply cutting across Main Street with a bag of groceries when a flicker of light caught her eye. It wasn't the glint of chrome from a bike. It was sharper, colder, the sun bouncing off the barrel of a handgun. In that split second, she saw where it was aimed. Duke Merritt, the president of the local Iron Brotherhood chapter, stood a few yards away, laughing with two of his men, completely unaware that he was standing in someone's crosshairs. Harper didn't freeze. She didn't think. She moved. Years of military reflex took over. A hard shove to Duke's chest, a twist of her own body to shield his. The blast split the air, the recoil ringing in her bones before pain exploded through her shoulder. The street went silent. Duke stumbled backward, staring at her with disbelief as she gritted her teeth and stayed on her feet. The shooter was already gone, swallowed by the maze of side streets. All that remained was the smell of gunpowder, Harper's blood dripping onto the pavement, and the quiet understanding that something between two strangers had just changed forever. 3 hours later, the quiet town of Millford would tremble to the sound of 120 Harley-Davidsons roaring in unison. They weren't rolling out for a charity ride. They were hunting. And what they did when they found the man who pulled the trigger would leave an entire town holding its breath. Nobody who was there that night ever told the full story. Until now. Before that day unraveled into sirens and blood, Harper's life was as quiet as she could make it. She had been out of the Navy for 6 years. 12 years of service, 2 deployments, 3 commendations, and a discharge that came with a handshake and a thank you that felt smaller than it should have. She traded all of it for a modest leather workshop 2 blocks from Main Street, the kind of place where locals brought in old jackets and saddlebags for repair. Her customers didn't ask much about her past. She didn't offer much in return. That was the arrangement, and it suited everyone just fine. Most mornings she was up before the sun. Coffee first, then the workbench. The smell of leather and linseed oil had become her version of normal. Steady, predictable, hers. She wasn't unhappy. She just wasn't fully present either. Like a woman who had come back from somewhere, but hadn't quite decided yet whether she was staying. The military doesn't leave you when you leave it. That's the part nobody warns you about. It stays in the way you sit with your back to the wall in restaurants. The way loud noises make your jaw tighten before your brain catches up. The way you read a room the moment you walk into it. Clocking exits, distances, faces. Harper had learned to carry all of that quietly. Most days nobody noticed. That morning had been uneventful. She'd stitched up a worn biker vest for a regular, adjusted a belt, and set a fresh pot of coffee to brew. Outside, the summer air was warm, carrying the low hum of motorcycles from a nearby gathering. In Millford, that sound was as common as church bells. She noticed Duke before she noticed the danger. He was posted just outside the diner's front window, leaning against the brick wall with a coffee in hand, talking to 2 patch-wearing members of the Iron Brotherhood. They were relaxed, laughing about something she couldn't hear, the kind of easy afternoon that makes you think nothing bad could happen. She looked away. It wasn't her world. She had no reason to look twice. But then the light caught her eye, and 12 years of training made a decision her mind hadn't finished making yet. That was Harper Cole. Not a hero, not someone looking for a fight. Just a woman who had spent 12 years learning to see what other people missed. And one afternoon when that skill meant the difference between a man going home and a man not going home at all. She never planned on any of it. But the Iron Brotherhood, and the man she had just saved had a very different idea about what happened next. And that idea had a name: Duke Merritt. Duke Merritt wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and a stillness about him that made people pay attention without knowing why. He had led the Iron Brotherhood for 11 years, not because he wanted the title, but because nobody else in the room made better decisions under pressure. That was the thing about Duke. He didn't chase authority. It just kept finding him. The Iron Brotherhood wasn't what most people assumed when they saw the leather and the bikes. They weren't a gang. They were veterans. Marines, Army, Navy, a few from units that didn't appear on official records. Men who had come back from places that changed them and found that the civilian world didn't quite fit anymore. Not because they were broken, but because once you've lived at that level of trust, where the man beside you is the only thing standing between you and a body bag, ordinary life feels thin. The Brotherhood gave them something solid to come back to, a reason to ride, a reason to show up. Duke had founded it with 3 other men in a garage outside Millford 12 years ago. 2 of those men were still riding with him. The third wasn't. His name was Cal Rooney, and Duke didn't talk about him, not to anyone. Cal was the kind of man who walked into a room and made it warmer. Quick with a laugh, slow to anger, and absolutely fearless in the way that only truly good people are. He and Duke had served together for 7 years. 2 deployments, back to back, the kind of time that turns strangers into brothers. When they came home, Cal was the one who said they should start something. A group, a ride, something that kept the band together. 3 years in, Cal was killed. Not overseas. Not in any line of duty. He was shot outside a bar in a town 2 hours from Millford by a man who had been threatening people in that community for months. Everyone knew it was coming. Nobody did anything. Not the locals. Not the authorities. Not Duke, who had heard about the situation secondhand and told himself it wasn't his place to get involved. He never forgave himself for that. It wasn't guilt that drove Duke after that night. It was something quieter and harder to shake. The knowledge that doing nothing is still a choice. That standing on the sideline while someone gets hurt makes you part of the story whether you want to be or not. He had carried that for 9 years. And then one Tuesday afternoon, a woman he barely knew took a bullet that was meant for him. Duke had met Harper Cole exactly 3 times. Once when she repaired a saddlebag for one of his riders. Once when he held the door open for her outside the hardware store and she nodded without slowing down. And once when he saw her through the window of her workshop, bent over the workbench alone at 7 in the evening, long after everyone else on the street had gone home. He didn't know her story then, but standing in that hospital corridor, looking at the bandage on her shoulder, he understood one thing clearly. He was not going to make the same mistake twice. That Tuesday had started like every other Tuesday. Harper opened the workshop at 8, stitched a torn jacket seam for a regular who came in every few weeks, fixed the buckle on a saddlebag, drank 2 cups of coffee and barely noticed the second one going cold. By early afternoon, she decided to close up early. Nothing dramatic about it. She was tired. The groceries weren't going to buy themselves. She locked the front door, slung a canvas bag over her shoulder, and stepped out into the summer heat. Main Street was alive the way it always was on warm afternoons. The diner had its windows open, and the smell of coffee and fried food drifted out onto the sidewalk. A few Iron Brotherhood bikes were parked in a loose row outside, chrome catching the sun, engines cool. Harper walked past them without a second glance. She had learned early on that the Brotherhood came and went through Millford like weather. You didn't need to pay attention to it. It was just part of the town. She was halfway down the block when she saw Duke. He was outside the diner, leaning against the brick wall with a coffee in hand, talking to two of his men. Easy conversation. The kind that happens when nobody is in a hurry. She registered him the way you register a familiar landmark. Noted, filed away, moved on. She kept walking, and then the light caught her eye. It was a small thing. The kind of thing that disappears if you blink. A sliver of reflection between two parked cars on the opposite side of the street. Too sharp, too still, wrong angle for anything ordinary. Her body knew before her mind did. The arm was already raised, the weapon already drawn, and the line from the barrel to Duke Merritt's chest was as straight and deliberate as anything she had ever seen downrange. She didn't shout a warning. There wasn't time. She closed the distance in 3 long strides, her boots hitting the pavement hard. She hit Duke with her shoulder, drove him sideways into the wall, and twisted her own body into the space he had just been standing in. The shot came half a second later. The sound was enormous, not just in her ears, but in her chest, her teeth, the back of her skull. The force spun her halfway around. Heat and pain detonated through her left shoulder like something had been torn loose from the inside. She didn't fall, she planted her feet, and she did not fall. The street went silent the way streets do after gunfire. That strange, stunned quiet where everyone stops at once, and the world seems to be deciding what to do next. Then it broke apart into shouts and movement, and someone screaming for an ambulance 3, 4, 5 times like repetition would make it come faster. Duke caught himself against the wall. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment he said absolutely nothing. Just stared at the woman standing in front of him with blood soaking through her jacket, grocery bag still hanging from her shoulder, jaw set like she was mildly inconvenienced. The shooter was gone, dissolved into the network of alleys behind the storefronts, as cleanly as if he'd never been there. Harper looked down at her shoulder, then back up at the street. Already her eyes were moving. Cataloging, scanning, doing the thing they had been trained to do for 12 years. He went left, she said. Into the alley behind Calloway's. Dark jacket, medium build. He knew the layout. Duke stared at her. He knew the layout, she said again. Quieter this time. More to herself than to him. That detail would matter later. More than anyone standing on that sidewalk understood yet. Around her, the afternoon had become something else entirely. People were out of the diner now, standing in the doorway. Phones were up. Someone was crying. A child somewhere nearby was asking a question that nobody was answering. And Harper Cole stood in the middle of all of it, bleeding, steady, already thinking 3 steps ahead, while the rest of Main Street was still trying to figure out what had just happened. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Harper sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, her arm in a clean white sling, a discharge packet folded in her lap. The bullet had gone clean through. Painful, but nothing that wouldn't heal. The doctor had used words like lucky and fortunate and you should rest. She had nodded at all of them and meant none of the responses she gave. She wasn't thinking about the pain. She was thinking about the alley behind Calloway's, about a man who moved through it like he had walked it before, about the angle of the shot and the timing of it and the particular kind of patience it takes to wait for exactly the right moment. This wasn't random. That much she knew. She was still turning it over in her mind when she heard the boots, heavy, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that clear a path without trying to. Duke Merritt walked into the waiting room like he didn't quite belong there. Leather vest, dark jeans, silver threading through his hair, and every head in the room turned without meaning to. He scanned the space until he found her. Then he crossed the floor and stopped a few feet away and stood there for a moment without saying anything. That surprised her. She had expected something immediate. Gratitude, maybe, or the kind of forced composure that men like Duke used as a substitute for it. Instead, he just stood there, like a man who had rehearsed something on the drive over and thrown it out the window when he walked through the door. "You didn't have to do that," he finally said. Harper looked up at him. "I know. I mean it. You didn't know me." "I knew enough," she said. "I knew where the gun was pointed." Duke pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. Not beside her, across. Like he wanted to be able to see her face when he talked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment he just looked at the floor between them. 12 years, he said. It wasn't a question. He had already asked someone. Navy, logistics and field operations. She paused. Among other things. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means I understand more than you're saying. The man who shot you, Duke said. We have a name. Harper was quiet. Ryan Voss, 23 years old, small time, works for people who don't like to be seen. He said it evenly, like he was reading from a file. He's not going to walk into a police station on his own. No, Harper agreed. He's not. So we're going to find him. She looked at him then, directly. The way she used to look at officers who had already made a decision and were presenting it as a discussion. And then what? She asked. Duke met her eyes. And then we make sure he doesn't disappear. There was a version of that sentence that meant something dark. Harper had heard enough versions of things in her life to know the difference. This one, the way he said it, the steadiness behind it, meant something else. Something closer to accountability than revenge. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said the thing she needed to say. Call Sheriff Briggs first, before anything else. Whatever you find tonight, he needs to know about it. That's how this stays clean. Duke didn't answer right away. Outside in the corridor, a nurse walked past, pushing a cart. The fluorescent lights hummed. You don't trust us, he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. I don't know you, Harper said. There's a difference. She shifted the sling slightly, winced without meaning to. But I know what happens when people decide to handle things themselves. I've seen it. It starts with the right intention and it ends with someone else getting hurt. Duke was quiet for a long time after that. Then he stood up, straightened his vest, and looked at her with something in his expression that hadn't been there when he walked in. Sheriff Briggs gets the first call, he said. Harper nodded once. Good. He turned to leave. Got 3 steps toward the door before he stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. For what it's worth, he said, Cal would have done the same thing you did today. Without thinking twice. He didn't explain who Cal was. He didn't need to. Harper watched him walk out through the sliding doors and into the evening light. She sat with that name for a moment, Cal, and the weight Duke carried when he said it. The particular weight of someone you couldn't save. She understood that weight better than she would ever say out loud. The parking lot outside Millford General was half empty at that hour. Duke sat on his bike without starting it. Just sat there, one boot on the ground, looking at nothing in particular. The evening air had cooled down some. Somewhere across the street, a sprinkler was running. Normal sounds. Normal evening. The kind that made what had happened on Main Street feel almost impossible. He pulled out his phone, turned it over in his hand twice, put it back in his pocket. He wasn't ready yet. There was a conversation he needed to have with himself first. The kind that doesn't happen out loud, but costs more than most conversations you'll ever have with another person. He had been carrying the pieces of it for 9 years. Since the night he got the call about Cal. Since the funeral where he sat in the 3rd row and stared at the flag on the casket and couldn't account for a single thought in his head. Cal had told him about the situation at that bar 2 months before it happened. Not asking for help exactly. More like thinking out loud the way Cal always did. Turning a problem over in conversation until it made sense. There was a man making trouble. Threatening people. Everyone in that town knew about it. Nobody was doing anything. Duke had listened, asked a few questions, and then said the words he had never been able to take back. Not our territory, Cal. Not our business. 6 weeks later, Cal Rooney was dead. Duke never said those words again. Not to anyone. Not about anything. But saying different words and actually being a different person, those were 2 separate things, and he knew it. He had spent 9 years knowing it. He pulled the phone out again. The first call was to Sheriff Hank Briggs. He had made Harper a promise, and he intended to keep it before he kept any other. Briggs picked up on the 2nd ring, already half informed. Word moved fast in Millford when something happened on Main Street. Duke told him what he knew about Ryan Voss. The name, the description, the alley behind Calloway's, and the detail Harper had flagged that was still sitting uneasily in the back of his mind. He knew the layout. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that confirmed what Duke had already started to suspect. Ryan Voss wasn't entirely unknown to the sheriff's department. He had been on the periphery of something Briggs had been trying to get traction on for over a year. Small operation. Local. The kind that stayed small deliberately because small was harder to see. "Don't move on him without me," Briggs said. "I won't move on him at all," Duke said. "But I'm going to find him, and when I do, you're going to want to be close by." He ended the call. Then he made the 2nd one, and the 3rd. And by the time he had worked through the first dozen names in his phone, the calls were making themselves. One rider telling 2 others, 2 others telling 4. The way it always worked when something serious was in motion. No orders were given. Nobody was told they had to come. That was never how the Brotherhood operated. You showed up because you chose to. Because you understood what was being asked and you decided it was worth answering. Within the hour, engines were turning over across 3 counties. Duke finally started his own bike. Sat for a moment listening to it idle. That particular sound that had been the steadiest thing in his life for the better part of a decade. Then he pulled out of the lot and pointed himself toward the south end of Millford. He thought about Cal the whole way there. Not with grief, exactly. More like a conversation he was finally finishing. This time, he thought. This time I'm not going to tell myself it isn't my business. The sound of one Harley-Davidson can turn heads. The sound of 120 moving in unison shakes the air itself. They came from 3 counties. Some had been on the road within 20 minutes of the first call. Others took longer. A jacket pulled on in a hurry. A wife or girlfriend told briefly where they were going. A truck loaded with a bike in the back because the trailer was faster than riding from that distance. They came the way people come when something matters. Not because they were told to, because they decided to. By 9 o'clock, Duke's garage on the edge of Millford looked like a different place entirely. Bikes lined the gravel lot in rows that spilled out onto the shoulder of the road, engines ticking as they cooled. Men standing in small groups, talking low. The kind of gathering that has its own gravity. You could feel it from half a block away. Duke stood at the front of the garage bay. He didn't have a podium, didn't need one. He waited until the conversations died down on their own. Then he spoke the way he always spoke, quietly enough that people had to pay attention to hear him. "Most of you know what happened today," he said. "A woman named Harper Cole saw something the rest of Main Street missed. She moved when nobody else did. She took the hit and she didn't go down." He paused. "She doesn't know most of us, she doesn't owe any of us anything, and she did it anyway." Nobody spoke. Ryan Voss pulled that trigger. He's somewhere in the South End tonight, and he is not going to walk away from this city and disappear. That's not going to happen. Another pause. "But I want to be clear about something. We are not going down there to hurt anyone. We are going down there to find him and make sure Sheriff Briggs has everything he needs to do his job. That's it. Anything else, anything, and you turn around and go home." I mean that. A few nods in the crowd. No objections. That was the thing about the Brotherhood. They had all seen enough of what happened when lines got crossed. None of them were interested in becoming the thing they were riding against. Duke looked across the gathered faces. Men he had ridden with for years. Men he had met only a handful of times. A few faces he didn't recognize at all, but who had come because someone they trusted had called them. A mechanic from Dalton County who had served 2 tours in Fallujah. A high school history teacher from the next town over who rode on weekends and had never missed a Brotherhood call in 4 years. A grandfather of 6 who had done 3 years in the army and still rode like he was 25. Ordinary people, every single one of them. "One more thing," Duke said. "Harper Cole is sitting in a hospital right now. She doesn't know we're here. She doesn't know any of this is happening." He looked across the lot. "After tonight, she will." He walked to his bike. Behind him, engines started. One at a time at first, then faster, until the whole lot was alive with sound. A low, rolling thunder that climbed up through the soles of your feet and settled somewhere in your chest. The riders fell into formation without being indicted. 2 abreast, staggered, the way they had ridden together 100 times before. Duke pulled out of the lot, and the column followed. On the far side of town, in a room on the 2nd floor of Millford General, Harper Cole heard the sound. She had been staring at the ceiling, running through the same details she had been running through for hours. The alley, the angle, the timing, the way Ryan Voss had moved through those back streets, like he had done it before. She got up and went to the window. The street below was empty, but the sound was getting closer. The south end of Millford wasn't the kind of place that made it onto the town's promotional materials. No boutique shops, no repainted storefronts, just a long stretch of industrial blocks that had been slowly emptying out for the better part of a decade. A couple of salvage yards, a row of storage units with rusting roll doors, and the kind of businesses that operated on cash and didn't keep regular hours. The kind of neighborhood that exists in every small town and that everyone in that small town pretends doesn't. The column moved through it, slowly. Headlights cutting through the dark in a long, unbroken line. Residents came to their windows. A few stepped out onto porches and stood there watching without saying anything. Nobody tried to block the road. Nobody asked questions. When 120 motorcycles roll through your street at 9:30 at night with that kind of purpose behind them, you understand instinctively that this is not the moment to insert yourself. Duke's lead riders had already done the groundwork. 2 of his most experienced men had gone ahead on foot. Former reconnaissance, both of them. And they had been feeding information back for the past 40 minutes. Ryan Voss was in the old Callaway warehouse on Decker Street. A building that had been sitting empty for 3 years. No registered activity. No legitimate reason for anyone to be inside. But here was the thing that had been nagging at Duke since his conversation with Sheriff Briggs. Ryan Voss was 23 years old. He was small-time. The kind of person who got hired for jobs because he was disposable and because he didn't ask enough questions to make himself dangerous to the people giving the orders. Men like Ryan Voss didn't plan operations. They executed them, which meant someone had given him Duke's location. That afternoon, someone had told him which window to stand between, and someone had known the layout of those alleys well enough to build an exit route into the plan. That someone was from Millford. Duke had sat with that conclusion for the past hour, and he didn't like what it meant. Because it meant this wasn't an outside problem that had drifted into town. It was an inside problem. The kind that had been growing quietly in the spaces people didn't look at. And the kind that required people to have been not looking for quite some time. Sheriff Briggs had confirmed as much. The operation he had been trying to build a case against for 14 months wasn't large. It didn't need to be. It moved stolen goods through the salvage yards on the south end, used the storage units as staging points, and had at least 2 or 3 people in town who weren't directly involved, but who knew enough to have said something and hadn't. Whether out of fear or convenience or simple willful blindness, Briggs couldn't say. Maybe a combination of all 3. Millford had been looking the other way. And Ryan Voss, whatever else he was, had been counting on it. The column came to a stop half a block from the warehouse. Engines dropped to idle, then cut one by one until the street was almost quiet. Duke held up a hand, and the riders behind him went still. He sat for a moment looking at the building. Corrugated metal siding, one small window on the upper level throwing a faint orange light. The kind of light that comes from a single bulb and a man trying not to be seen. Briggs pulled up in an unmarked car 2 minutes later. He got out and walked over to Duke without hurrying. "He's in there?" Briggs asked. "Second floor, northeast corner. Been there at least 2 hours, according to my people." Briggs looked at the building, then at the column of bikes stretching back down the street. Then back at Duke. "I need you to hold here," Briggs said. "Let me do this by the book." "I know," Duke said, "but I want 5 minutes with him first." Briggs studied him. "Duke, 5 minutes. Before you go in, I'm not going to touch him." He held the sheriff's gaze. "You have my word." A long pause. The kind that meant Briggs was weighing something he already knew the answer to, but needed a moment to arrive at officially. 5 minutes, Briggs said. "And I'm standing outside the door." Duke nodded. He swung off his bike and handed his keys to the rider beside him. Then he walked toward the warehouse alone, no jacket unzipped, no weapon, nothing in his hands. While behind him 120 men sat quietly in the dark and waited. It was the longest walk of his life. Not because he was afraid of what was inside, but because he finally understood what he was walking toward had nothing to do with Ryan Voss. The warehouse was dark except for that single bulb on the upper level. Duke found the side door unlocked, which told him Ryan Voss hadn't planned on being here long. A man who intends to stay locks his doors. A man who is waiting for a chance to run leaves them open. He took the stairs slowly, not because he was being cautious, because he wanted Ryan to hear him coming. There was no point in surprises. That wasn't what this was. The upper floor was one open room, broken pallets stacked against one wall, a few old drums in the corner, the smell of rust and stale air, and something that might have been motor oil from when this building still had a purpose. The single bulb hung from a cord near the center of the ceiling, and swayed slightly in the draft from the stairwell. Ryan Voss was sitting on the floor in the far corner, with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up. He looked younger than 23. He looked, if Duke was being honest, like a kid who had done something he couldn't undo and had spent the last several hours sitting alone with that fact. He scrambled to his feet when Duke appeared at the top of the stairs. His eyes went immediately to the door behind Duke, then to the window, running the same calculation that people run when they realize there is no good option left. "There's 120 people outside," Duke said, "and a sheriff who is standing directly below us. So whatever you're thinking, stop thinking it." Ryan stopped moving, but his eyes were still working. Duke walked to the center of the room and stopped. He didn't move toward Ryan. He didn't need to. He just stood there under that single swaying bulb and looked at the young man across from him. "I'm not here to hurt you," Duke said. Ryan said nothing. His jaw was tight and his breathing was shallow, and he had the look of someone who has heard that sentence before in circumstances where it turned out not to be true. "I mean that literally," Duke said. "I gave my word to the sheriff downstairs, and I gave my word to myself, and those are the only two things in my life I have never broken." He paused. "You're going to walk out of here tonight, and you're going to go with Briggs, and you're going to tell him everything you know about who hired you and how and why. That's what's going to happen. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you because it's the only version of tonight that ends without your life getting completely destroyed." Ryan's voice came out smaller than he probably intended. "You don't know anything about my life." "No," Duke said. "I don't." He pulled an old crate away from the wall and sat down on it, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. Like this was a conversation between two people rather than a confrontation between a hunter and the thing he had been hunting. "I know a man named Cal Rooney," Duke said. "Knew him. He died 9 years ago outside a bar in a town called Reston, shot by a man who had been threatening people in that community for the better part of a year." He looked at Ryan steadily. Everyone knew it was coming. Nobody said anything. The people who could have spoken up decided it wasn't their business, decided to look the other way. He paused. "I was one of those people." Ryan was very still now, not the stillness of someone about to run, the stillness of someone who is actually listening. "I have thought about Cal Rooney every single day for 9 years, Duke said. Not because I pulled a trigger, because I didn't do anything, because I told myself it wasn't my place, because I made the comfortable choice and a good man died, and I have to live with that." He leaned forward slightly. "You understand what I'm telling you?" A long silence. "Today," Duke continued, "a woman named Harper Cole saw something on Main Street that every other person on that street missed or ignored. She had about 3 seconds to make a decision. She could have kept walking. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have even known she saw it." He stopped. She didn't keep walking. Ryan looked at the floor. "She took a bullet that was meant for me. A woman who has never asked this town for a single thing, who has been living quietly in that workshop on Henderson Street for 6 years, just trying to put her life back together, stepped in front of a gun for a man she barely knew." Duke's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it now. Something that had been building for 9 years and had finally found the right room to be said in. "And you pulled that trigger. You did that to her." The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Ryan Voss sat down slowly, back against the wall, knees up, the same position Duke had found him in. But something had shifted in his face. The calculation was gone, replaced by something rawer and harder to look at. "I didn't know anyone was going to get hurt," Ryan said. His voice was unsteady. "I mean, I knew what I was hired to do. But I didn't think you didn't think," Duke said. "Not as an accusation, just as a fact. That's the thing, isn't it? It's almost never malice, almost never pure evil. It's just not thinking. Not asking the questions you already know the answers to. Not letting yourself see what's right in front of you." Ryan's eyes were wet. He turned his face toward the wall. Duke stood up. "There's a woman in a hospital tonight because of the choice you made today," he said. "That's going to be true for the rest of your life. You don't get to unfeel that. You don't get to explain it away." He walked toward the stairs. "But you do get to choose what you do next. And what you do next is you go downstairs and you talk to Sheriff Briggs and you tell him everything, every name, every location, everything." He stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back. "Don't make the mistake I made," Duke said. "Don't tell yourself it isn't your business. Don't look the other way because it's easier." A pause. "It isn't easier. Trust me. 9 years from now, you'll still be sitting with it." He went down the stairs. Behind him, after a long moment, he heard Ryan Voss get to his feet, and then the slow, unsteady sound of footsteps following him down. Sheriff Hank Briggs had been in law enforcement for 27 years. He had seen a lot of things come through the doors of his department. Domestic disputes that turned into something worse. Drug cases that unraveled slowly over months, until one day they didn't. The occasional violent incident that reminded everyone in Millford that small towns weren't exempt from the things that happened in larger ones. But he had never seen anything quite like the sight of Duke Merritt walking out of a warehouse with a 23-year-old shooter following 2 steps behind him. Voluntary, uncoerced, and apparently ready to talk. Briggs pushed off the wall where he had been leaning and walked forward. 2 deputies fell in on either side of Ryan Voss without being told to. Ryan didn't resist, didn't look for an exit. He kept his eyes on the ground and put his hands where they needed to be, and said quietly that he understood his rights when Briggs read them to him. It was the most orderly arrest Briggs had made in recent memory. He looked at Duke over Ryan's shoulder. Duke gave him a small nod. "Nothing more." "He's going to talk," Duke said. "Give him a minute before you start. He needs a minute." Briggs studied him. "What did you say to him up there?" "The truth," Duke said. "Just the truth." Ryan Voss talked for 3 hours, not because he was pressured, not because anyone made promises they couldn't keep. He talked because somewhere in that dark warehouse, something had shifted, and once it shifts that way, it doesn't shift back. He gave Briggs 4 names. 2 of them were people Briggs already had on the periphery of his investigation. Names that kept appearing in the background of things without ever quite being attached to anything solid enough to act on. The other 2 were new. One of them was a name that made Briggs sit back in his chair and look at the ceiling for a moment before he wrote it down. It was a name Millford knew, a name that belonged to someone who had been a visible, unremarkable part of this community for years. The kind of person nobody looks at twice because they have never given anyone a reason to. That was the point, of course. That was always the point. The operation itself was not sophisticated. Stolen equipment moved through the salvage yards on Decker Street, staged in the storage units, redistributed through a network that extended into 2 neighboring counties. It had been running for just under 3 years. It had stayed small deliberately, small enough to avoid the kind of attention that larger operations attracted, large enough to be worth running. The people behind it had understood something that a lot of criminals don't. That the best place to hide is in plain sight, in a community that has decided, consciously or not, that some things are easier not to see. Briggs had been trying to get traction on it for 14 months. He had the shape of it, but never enough substance, never enough for a prosecutor to take seriously. Ryan Voss gave him the substance. By midnight, 2 of the 4 names were in custody. By 2 in the morning, search warrants had been executed on the salvage yard and 2 of the storage units. By the time the sun came up over Millford the following morning, the case that Hank Briggs had been slowly, frustratingly building for over a year had broken open in a single night. He would think about that for a long time afterward, about how these things work, about how 14 months of careful, methodical work can sit completely still. And then one woman takes a bullet on Main Street and everything moves. He would think about Harper Cole and what she had set in motion without knowing she was setting anything in motion at all. Outside the warehouse, the Iron Brotherhood was still there. They had waited the whole time. Nobody left. Nobody got restless. They sat on their bikes or stood beside them in the dark, and they waited because that was what they had come to do. Bear witness, hold the perimeter, make sure this particular night ended the right way. When Duke came out and gave them the word, there was no celebration, no noise, just a collective settling, the particular exhale of a group of people who had shown up for something serious and seen it through. Duke stood in front of them for a moment. "Briggs has him," he said. "It's done." A few quiet words passed between riders. Someone put a hand briefly on Duke's shoulder. That was all. Then Duke said the thing they all already knew was coming. "There's someone at Millford General who doesn't know any of this happened," he said. "I think it's time she found out she's got people in this town." He started his bike. Behind him, 120 engines turned over in the dark. Harper heard them before she saw them. She had been lying in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling for the better part of 2 hours, turning the same details over in her mind, the way she always did when something didn't sit right. The layout of the alley, the timing of the shot, the name Ryan Voss, and what it connected to, and what it meant that someone in this town had known enough to build a plan around. Then the sound reached her, low at first, then fuller, then everywhere, coming up through the floor, through the walls, vibrating gently in the window glass beside her bed. She got up, crossed to the window. Main Street below was empty. But the sound was close now, rolling in from the direction of the south end, like something that had been building for hours, and had finally arrived where it was always going. Then the headlights appeared, 1 pair, then 10, then too many to count. A long, unbroken river of light turning onto the street below and coming to a slow, deliberate stop in front of the hospital entrance. Engine by engine, the sound dropped away until the street was quiet again, and 120 men sat on their bikes in the dark and said nothing. Harper stood at the window for a long moment. Then she put on her jacket over her sling, walked down the corridor, took the elevator to the ground floor, and pushed through the front doors. The night air was cool, the kind of cool that comes after a long, hot day when the temperature finally remembers what it's supposed to be doing. Duke Merritt was standing at the bottom of the steps. He looked like a man who had been through something and come out the other side of it. Not unscathed, but intact. He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Behind him the street was full of people who had ridden through the night for a woman most of them had never met. "Ryan Voss is in custody," Duke said. "Briggs has everything he needs. It's done." Harper took that in. "And the rest of it?" she asked. Because she already knew there was a rest of it. Being handled, Duke said. The right way. She nodded slowly, looked out at the riders, faces she didn't know. People who had no reason to be here at this hour, except that they had decided to be. Duke took a step forward. You've been alone in this town for 6 years, he said. You don't have to keep doing that. Harper looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't a person who accepted things easily. Wasn't built for it. 6 years of keeping her own company had made her fluent in self-sufficiency and suspicious of offers she hadn't asked for. But she was tired. Not from the shoulder. From the other thing. The longer thing. The weight of being somewhere without belonging to it. Okay, she said. Just that. One word. But Duke nodded like she had said everything. Millford didn't become a different town overnight. That's not how towns work. That's not how people work either. The salvage yards on Decker Street went quiet. 2 names that had been fixtures in the community for years disappeared from it. And the people who had known, who had seen enough to say something and chosen not to, had to live with that knowledge in a new way, now that it was no longer private. Some of them did something about it, came forward, talked to Briggs, made the call they should have made a year ago. Not because anyone forced them, but because it's harder to look the other way once you've watched someone else refuse to. That's the thing Harper Cole did that nobody talks about enough. Not the bullet, not the reflex, not the 12 years of training that made her body move before her mind gave the order. Those things matter, but they're not the lesson. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. She saw something, and she didn't look away. Harper went back to the workshop on Henderson Street. The leather, the linseed oil, the early mornings and the cold coffee, and the customers who didn't ask questions. All of it exactly as she had left it, but not quite the same. Duke came by 3 weeks later with a jacket that needed a new zipper, a job that took 20 minutes and didn't require a trip across town. They both knew that. Neither of them mentioned it. He sat on the stool by the workbench and drank her coffee, and they talked the way people talk when they are still figuring out what they are to each other, but have already decided they are something. It was a start. Ryan Voss pled guilty 4 months later. In his statement, he said something that the local paper quoted, and that a few people in Millford cut out and kept. He said that nobody had ever sat down with him the way Duke Merritt had, and made him look at what he had actually done. Not what he had been charged with. Not the legal version of it. The human version, the part where a real person got hurt, and that hurt had a weight and a shape and didn't go away just because he was sitting in a different room now. He said it was the hardest conversation he had ever had. He said it was the only one that ever meant anything. Harper Cole never called herself a hero. If you asked her what she did that afternoon on Main Street, she would tell you she saw something that needed doing and she did it. She would say it the same way she said most things, simply without decoration, like the words were just the words and didn't need anything added to them. But here's what I think. I think the world is full of moments where something needs doing, and the only question is whether the person who sees it is going to keep walking or not. Harper didn't keep walking, and everything that followed, the 120 riders, the arrest, the names that came to light, the slow and imperfect process of a community deciding to be more honest with itself. All of it started with 1 woman and 3 seconds, and a choice that nobody asked her to make. That's not nothing. That's everything. Every story here was lived by someone like you. Subscribe? Not for us. For the next time you need to remember what people are capable of.